Thanks so much for sticking around for the last talk of the day. I'm really excited to have Nadia Heninger here from UC San Diego. For those of you who don't know Nadia's work, she's done some of the most influential work in applied crypto over the last, say, 10 years in both analysis and cryptanalysis of deployed protocols. So lots of factoring, discrete log, analysis of TLS, and has had a ton of impact both in research and in what systems are used in practice. She's won Best Paper awards from all the conferences and Test of Time awards, and is also a wonderful speaker. So thanks for coming.
So thank you so much for having me. And it's always nice to be back in Cambridge, enjoying your lovely weather. This talk, I heard some grumbling about the title, like how do you pronounce that? So I made up this title. It is a combination of two words, cryptanalysis and economics. So this talk is about sort of the structure of our field and the different incentives in play and how they influence the kind of research that gets done. So this is a meta talk, which is a bunch of inside baseball. So I apologize to people who are a little bit outside of the field. Some of this may be intelligible and some of it may be like too obscure academic politics. So, but this talk is going to be a mix of semi-spicy opinions, which you may or may not agree with, and you can, if you want to sidetrack me, like that's cool. We can get totally sidetracked if you want. That might be fun. So that's kind of the plan here. Is I will give you semi-informed, semi-spicy opinions on a variety of topics that I have a varying amount of expertise on. But I have opinions because I've been doing this for 15 years, I guess. Okay, so here's my made-up title with made-up word. And yeah, okay, so cryptanalysis and economics. And it's the economics in the sense of markets and incentives rather than money, strictly speaking, although money is part of it. Okay, so the starting point here is if we think of ourselves as a research field, we have some inputs, which are essentially, we get funding from like governments and companies and like our institutions in the States and whatnot. And then we have a bunch of human effort from researchers, professors, students, so on and so forth. And like any academic field, we produce outputs. And generally the outputs from any academic field are, we write papers and we train students who then go like contribute to the workforce and are like part of the development of our civilization. So that's like academia as a whole. And then like within cryptography as a field, we have another output, which is a set of cryptographic algorithms that we say these are good algorithms that everybody should be using, that we should use in this protocol, which is like proven secure and whatnot. And like with these parameters, and like we have proven it secure in this way, and we say, world, go out and use this. Do not invent your own cryptography. We know what you're doing. You don't. So use this stuff. So like as a field, we have this extra output, which is we say like, we're a science. We know what we're doing. Here's the algorithms that you should be using. So this is our sort of like extra thing. So this is our like super simplified version of the world that, you know, and clearly there are like incentives and structures in play here in what gets funded and what people choose to work on. The other thing that's interesting about cryptography as a field of study is that not all fields have the sort of duality that we do. So cryptography security, there's a constructive side and there's a destructive side. And one side in the field of cryptography builds cryptography. The other side destroys it. That is not a typo. Some of you may get the joke. Who gets the joke? Some of you get the joke. Okay. So yes, and you might think, okay, like we actually heard some very nice talks about complexity theory and lower bounds, and so you might think like, really like the way, okay, so we have a side that constructs cryptography, and then we have a side that like tries to attack cryptography, because that's really the only way that we know how to show that something is secure is like people have looked at this for some number of years and nobody has broken it yet. And you might think like maybe it's really only necessary to do research in cryptanalysis because complexity theory, this is a failure of complexity theory. Really, like, if we had strong lower bounds for certain problems, like, we would not need all of these people to try to break things, because we could just, like, have some concrete complexity lower bound for some fundamental problem that we could then build cryptography off of. Well, I mean, we would also have to, like, resolve P versus NP first in order to, like, do something like that. So it's pretty far out of reach. But even in a fantasy world where we could do that, we still need attack work, period, because you have to have the attacks in order to inspire the security models that you want to prove things to be secure in. So this is my, like, argument for why attack work in general and cryptanalysis in general isn't done, and why, like, sort of we need that to be a healthy side of the field. Okay, and I also want to draw a sort of analogy to this super interesting essay by Tim Gowers. Who's read this essay? It's, like, really enlightening, actually. If you like math, I recommend, like, looking it up and reading it, because it's very interesting and very beautiful. So he writes this essay about the two cultures of mathematics. And many people have written about this topic in various formulations. But he sort of divides mathematicians into two worlds. One of them, like, one set of mathematicians lives to solve problems. And then the other sort of set of mathematicians want to build and understand theories. And I think other thinkers have called these, like, frogs and eagles, for example. And so what Gowers does in his essay is he talks about how this way of dividing up mathematicians ends up influencing the way that the field regards certain subfields of mathematics. So there are fields that are largely problem-solving, like combinatorics, and there are fields that are much more theory-building, like algebraic geometry. And what ended up happening in mathematics is that the sort of combinatorics fields was generally thought of as, like, less prestigious than algebraic geometry, because they were not doing all of this beautiful theory building. And that prestige influences the kinds of research that gets done and what students study. And then I want sort of, if we go back to being in cryptography, cryptanalysis is much more towards the problem-solving side than the theory-building side of our field. And so I think there's, like, a similar structural issue going on there, that it is somehow, like, less highly regarded in a way. And if I make a super simplistic sort of caricature of the kinds of messaging that happens from the different sides of the field, if you listen to people who give talks about sort of constructive cryptography, I mean, it's beautiful. They're, like, exploring the underlying truth of the computational universe, and they're building, like, a bright future full of privacy-preserving technologies that will allow companies to collect and process all the data they want without any legal liability whatsoever. And I mean, clearly this is, like, companies love this stuff. They are building the future, and they can do whatever they want because magic technology will let them do it. Whereas, like, on the other side, like, I mean, researchers are just destroying perfectly good cryptographic algorithms with, like, one-off tricks, and, like, okay, like, somebody screwed up their parameters. Okay, you fix the parameters, and then you, like, end up in this sort of, like, cycle. But, like, really, it's just, like, a question of parameters. Like, there's some parameters that work, surely. And, like, this is not building the future. This is destroying the future. So, like, why would any company want to fund that? Like, there's no reason. Why would they do that? They want to fund the future, not the past. And they don't want to fund destruction. They want to fund things that are building the future. Okay, and this extends to, like, there are certain people in the field who do not think that attack work is, like, valid science. This applies more to, like, security than, like, cryptanalysis. At least with cryptanalysis, if you're doing stuff that requires, like, a PhD in math to understand, it's hard to claim that that's not, like, valid research. But, like, there's kind of this notion that it's, like, less scientific and it's less valuable. And just as, like, comfort for any students who are in the room, I want to provide some anecdotes from when I was on the job market the first time around as a junior professor. This was an embarrassing long time. I guess it was, like, 13 years ago. So this was a while ago. But the kinds of questions that I got, there was this notion that, like, what we really needed was, like, a science of security. And in breaking things, this is not scientific. You're just finding bugs. Like, really, we need to solve this by making a science of security, and then we will no longer have to deal with all of these bugs. Is that a hand?
Yeah, I was confused about something.
Yeah?
Go back 2 slides.
This
yeah,
one?
I'm confused why it's implied that privacy-preserving technologies would allow companies to, like, helps companies to collect data. You would think that, privacy, like, stops them from collecting data and protects privacy, like, users.
Wait, I can't hear all the words you're saying.
Okay. So it's implied, from my understanding, that it says privacy-preserving technologies will help companies collect and process a lot of data, right? Like, just from like association, like word association, it feels like you would think that privacy-preserving technologies stops them from collecting data from, like, servers, people. So, like, I'm just curious, what's the connection? Why does that help that?
I'm being a little bit provocative here. I mean, you could hear the you could hear the snickers when half the room got the implication here. So basically, the reason that companies are interested in something like fully homomorphic encryption is because what they want is to continue collecting all the data that they can on their customers, and then be able to, like, do all the metrics that they want without, like, having to share the data across departments, having to share the data, like, to other companies, but also, like, to basically tell like, whenever they get hacked, that they don't need to, like, actually report any data breaches because no information was revealed because it was all encrypted. So you still want to have all of the surveillance capitalism that is, like, sort of funding the internet, but without any of the problems that come from the lack of fundamental security that we have with computers, basically. Yeah, so, like, I mean, we know that companies, they want fully homomorphic encryption because they want a magic box. And the magic box is going to solve all of their cybersecurity problems. That is what they think that they are going to get. Okay, which they, maybe someday they will. I don't know. Okay, so basically the underlying thesis for my talk is that, like all good dualities, there is no light without the dark. And I think that in some areas of cryptography, the two sides of our field are out of balance. And this imbalance is leading to insecurity. I don't have necessarily a solution, but I want to pose the problem and be, like, provocative here. And maybe somebody will come up with a solution. Or maybe I'll just encourage you to, like, break some more stuff, because it's fun. So I think basically every talk that I give, there is some XKCD cartoon, at least one in it, because there's always an appropriate XKCD cartoon. So this is the relevant XKCD cartoon for this talk, which is basically all modern infrastructure is this amazing tower that is built upon some project that some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. Yeah?
What is the left pad of cryptography?
The what?
The left pad of cryptography. Sorry, there's probably some reference to a JavaScript package called left pad.
Oh.
What is, which does exactly what it sounds like. Do we? Great.
So, actually, I'm going to get my water for a second. This is, oh,
Happy to
thank you.
ask a great question.
Yes, you predicted exactly the structure of my slides. This is great. So I've got a few more variants of this, but sort of in line, actually, with the previous talk, which I think led very, very well into, like, the first half of this talk that I'm going to be giving. Basically, yeah, all modern digital infrastructure, which is that, like, we will be relying on RSA for decades to come, and everything does rely on RSA for, like, has been relying on RSA for decades. The security of RSA relies very closely on the fact that we believe that classical factoring costs precisely L of 1/3 with cube root of 64 over 9. If you change either of those numbers, it's a bad time. So I'll talk about that more. Okay, so for this project, which I started this project and, like, as with all good projects, I was, like, overambitious. And I actually talked to a large number of people over the past year who do either relevant things, and most of these people have done some kind of attack work in various areas of cryptography. And this is not a representative sample at all. This is just like who I thought of to talk to and the people that I thought would respond to my emails or whatever. So we had super interesting conversations, which I should have recorded more carefully, and I didn't. But I have recorded sort of parts of them, and I have incorporated parts of the things into this talk. So this talk, these people are not to blame for anything that is in this talk, but I do have quotes that I attribute to them and various ideas. But yeah, okay, so these conversations were quite wide-ranging, but among other things, okay, Martin Albrecht complains that you're asking all these weird introspection questions that are kind of hard to answer. So it may or may not have been, useful or coherent. And the other thing that I want to say is that I live in the open research world. And so one of the things that Paul Kocher mentioned is that the balance is really different in the government and classified world, where offense gets the lion's share of the budget and glory, and they may have the opposite imbalance from the academic world. And we have some evidence in the open world that prioritizing offense over defense in the government has led to problems. So things like, famously, I teach this every year to my students in intro crypto classes, like the story of the NSA shortening the key strength of DES, which caused it to become obsolete quite a bit earlier than it would have otherwise. And then we have the dual EC DRBG debacle. And there's continuing mistrust around standardization algorithm recommendations that have definitely influenced the ongoing NIST post-quantum process. So, okay. So I am talking about incentives mostly in the open cryptography research world. So now I have a collection of thoughts about different areas. So my first one is quantum computing, and I want to say I am not a quantum computing person. I live purely in the classical world. I, in fact, only understand quantum computing at a super cartoon level. So these are things that I have gathered, but you may disagree with what I'm going to say. But I think the last talk before the break introduced this quite nicely, which is essentially that the looming threat of quantum computers is just about the biggest thing in our field in the past several years. And when we think about quantum computers, we think of Shor's algorithm, because Shor's algorithm is going to break all classical public key cryptography. The thing that's interesting, so you go into a group of cryptographers and they talk about quantum computers as Shor's algorithm, Shor's algorithm, Shor's algorithm, factoring, discrete log, elliptic curve, discrete log, we're hosed. But if you go to a talk by the people who are actually building quantum computers, they don't want to talk about Shor's algorithm. They only talk about it as a proof of concept or maybe some academic demonstration. They do not talk about it as the killer app for quantum computing. What they talk about is quantum chemistry simulations. So they don't care about Shor's algorithm, because who cares about Shor's algorithm when you can solve world hunger by building better fertilizer, or you're going to solve disease by doing drug discovery, or you're going to solve energy problems by building better batteries and solar cells. This is what the people who are if you go to these talks where they're actually we built a qubit, this is what they talk about. And if you're hey, so when are we going to have Shor's algorithm? They avoid that question. They do not want to answer it. Which is this weird disconnect, because crypto versus the quantum people. Yeah?
Since you were talking about incentives, right?
Yeah.
One reason for this might be that NSA or NIST just put out this directive that said by 2035, please stop using RSA. So by the time we build a quantum computer that could factor, it would be that nobody in the world is using RSA at all, which decreases significantly the incentive to build a quantum computer that can factor in the first place.
People are still going to be using RSA in 2035. People are still going to be using RSA for decades after a quantum computer is built.
But sort of new uses of cryptography are not going to be, people are going to start slowly shifting. We can sort of argue about the magnitude of that shift, but that could be a reason why there isn't more.
But there are all these archives things
Yes.
that use.
Fair enough.
So, okay, so there's data centers in Utah full of information that is encrypted in, yeah.
Is that information valuable when it's decrypted?
Yes.
Who knows?
I mean, that's a great question. But you know, if nobody actually ever builds a computer where you could use Shor's algorithm, then like, do we need to transfer, like, change all of our cryptography? Maybe we should just keep using RSA.
It doesn't seem like we have a choice, right? I mean, the government systems are apparently supposed to use one of these new quantum things by 2035. So
Yeah, so it's clear that we will have a transition. I'll get through this like section because I think that there's like there's a little bit of a weird disconnect that I want to like to point out, and like maybe the people who know more about quantum computing can like help solve this disconnect. I think, so one of the most enlightening things that I read about quantum computing was, this is a National Academy's report, which is now getting quite old. It's like 6 years old. I don't think the conclusions have changed, even though we have had like some progress in building quantum computers. So I guess the most recent like sort of news-making progress was like the Google announcement that like they think that they may be able to do error correction. Like that nobody has actually demonstrated quantum error correction yet, but they like think that they can probably do it in the future. So that's the current state. So we're still at the point where we cannot simulate a single logical qubit. This National Academy's report, the first couple of chapters I think are like really super well written, and like I found them very enlightening. Basically, the introduction is like sort of a history of the like classical semiconductor industry in the 20th century, and talking about like how transistors were developed, and essentially that like the development of classical computers is the story of like in order to get an exponential like rate of progress in like building classical computers, we had this virtuous cycle where the first computers were like extremely useful and people bought them because you needed to do that kind of computation even with like room-sized computers, and then the companies building those computers rolled all of their profits back into R&D and then improved their computers, and then we had this virtuous cycle, which is what led to Moore's law, which is what led to the amazing developments in technology that we have now. And the argument made in this report is that to build an entirely new computer architecture, like a quantum computer, we need to have the scale of engineering challenges is such that the investment required to do all of that engineering is probably beyond the scale of a single government acting alone, so like beyond the scale of like the NSA or the Chinese government. Even though they may be willing to put in billions of dollars, you actually probably need more on the order of trillions of dollars, like an entire economy's worth of virtuous cycle in order to actually fund that, that kind of engineering progress. And so sort of the like conclusion is that like it may be beyond the scale of a single government to like actually build like a fully scalable like quantum computer. You may need like a real virtuous cycle, which means that you need applications for quantum computing. And so the question is, what applications do we have? And okay, so like we've also like heard about this from previous talks. So like, you know, I talked to Scott Aronson. He estimates that there's billions of dollars of investment in quantum computing right now. And the question is, for what? Because it's not Shor's algorithm, because there's no market for Shor's algorithm. It's really, I mean, the only people who want to run Shor's algorithm are the NSA and China. So like, what do Google and IBM think that they are investing in? And really, the only real application for quantum computers is this quantum chemistry simulation, which means that there certainly is a market for like a specialized scientific equipment being sold to like biotech companies and whatnot. So like, you know, if you have a quantum computer that's like a $100,000 machine that can get a speed up on quantum chemistry simulations, there's definitely a market for that. But for everything else, we don't, I mean, we actually just heard a great talk about this. We don't have like exponential time speedups for most problems. So all the stuff about like machine learning or optimization, like you get some polynomial time speedups, but it's sort of unclear whether there's actually like a real market or need for that. And so there's this weird disconnect where like the only thing quantum computers are good for is breaking cryptography. But the only people who care about breaking cryptography are governments. And so like just realistically, like for, we can do some threat modeling like for, any entity who's using cryptography. If your attacker is breaking cryptography, they're either pirating copy protected content or they're a government. Like essentially nobody else cares enough to break cryptography. And like this is great news because like cryptography is doing way better than the rest of security, where it's just a constant disaster all the time. So like, I mean, essentially like this is like, how you just have to outrun your other colleagues in front of the bear. Like then you're doing great, right? Like, essentially like cryptography essentially makes like, we know that real systems get compromised by like phishing and social engineering and not really breaking cryptography most of the time, unless your adversary is a government. And so like those are somebody else's problem, really. Like cryptography, we're doing great. But that means that like normal people don't need to run Shor's algorithm on their cell phones. So we don't need a quantum, we don't need a quantum coprocessor on every smartphone in the world. So what are quantum computers for? Essentially, like there's no mass market for Shor's algorithm. The customers for Shor's algorithm are a handful of large governments. The people who are building quantum computers think of Shor's algorithm as a proof of concept and not an end product. And so if Shor's algorithm ever becomes feasible, it's going to be a byproduct of other things that the market cares more about. And so if it is a direct byproduct of quantum chemistry simulations, then we may be in trouble. But if you need something much beyond that, then I don't know, is it ever going to be built? Like, because the market incentives just aren't there. So I just wanted to point out this disconnect. So this is my first like spicy opinion on quantum computing, which is not my research area. Yeah?
If they're going to build, like invest and do research and build these quantum computers for whatever reason, whether it's chemical simulation or whatever, then they'll be able to implement Shor's algorithm. Once they have the technology there, then it will be like that.
So if the qubits you need to do quantum chemistry simulations work in the same way, and like the circuits that you need to build and the error correction that you need to do, if that is all the same, then yes, it will happen. If you need to do something else architecturally, then it seems less likely to happen. Yeah?
I just heard of a lunch. I'm not going to attribute to one of the quantum faculty members here that quantum factoring is an easier problem, completely in terms of building, than quantum chemistry. Again, this is a black box statement. I don't know any details, and I'm not even attributing to anybody. So
this is interesting. This is the first time that I've heard that factoring is easier than quantum chemistry.
I privately tell you that is.
Okay, we will talk offline then.
Yeah.
The statement was that an unknown source says. An unnamed source says that factoring is easier than quantum chemistry simulation. So if that's the case, I guess that sets up an interesting set of incentives. So if factoring goes along the way to building like the $100,000 specialized like scientific equipment that you can sell to like biotech companies, if there's enough of a market to sell the specialized scientific equipment to like to biotech companies plus sell your factoring machines to the NSA, then like yeah, maybe the things are maybe the incentives are aligned.
So another incentive is to be richer than Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Potentially.
Okay, so yes, you were saying there was a market for stealing Bitcoin, and So yeah, I mean, the question is there anything that could get Bitcoin to go away? And I don't think the security claims of cryptocurrencies are why people keep investing in them. So yeah. I don't know like whether the engineering challenges can be overcome in building a quantum computer. I mean, I think none of us do, right? And like this is also not our area because we do like the cryptography and like maybe the algorithm side, but not the like, you know, deep frozen qubit side. But it's, yeah. It is an entirely new computing architecture, and we've had proposals for very compelling, entirely new computing architectures in the past. Like you talk to graybeards and they'll talk about like optical computing in the 90s, and like we don't have optical computers now, even though they could do like super awesome things. So, yeah. I think it's just worth thinking about like what good is an entirely new computing architecture for? And clearly, like we have some applications, but we don't have general purpose computing applications. And so the question is like, is there a market for the special purpose computing applications that they are good for, that is enough to fund the engineering developments?
The financial industry is very dependent on traditional cryptography. If they don't change, then there's certainly an incentive for a malign actor to go after it, the whole thing.
I don't think cryptography is really the thing that is protecting the financial industry. I think regulation is the thing that's protecting the financial industry. I mean, you know, large portions of the finance industry are still using single DES from what I hear. So like, I don't know. So, okay, actually, so if we go to the topic of who is willing to bet on factoring, like quantumly versus classically. And I made this slide before I heard of any bets that Vinod was willing to put money towards. So I asked my various panelists their opinions of whether 2048-bit RSA would happen classically or quantumly first, and they were split. So some people said quantum, some people said classical. Antoine Ju has a running bet against Dan Bernstein on this topic.
Quantumly first.
Yes, 2048 bits. Actually, like on the topic of the talk that just preceded mine, I think it is a compelling argument. This was raised by Thomas Bitow, that you know, the original Shor's algorithm was clearly sort of infeasible to build with a reasonable number of physical qubits. But perhaps we will actually sort of meet in the middle with algorithmic improvements. That this is like a compelling line of research. Yeah?
Do you have a timeline on any of these? That's like,
No.
so it could be.
So this is yeah. Instead of saying like by 2040 we're going to have like 40-bit RSA, this is just quantum versus classical. Who gets to 2048 bits first? So this seems like a compelling direction, essentially. Like in order for Shor's algorithm to actually become feasible, we really need to get the complexity down. We've heard this from multiple angles. So that's cool. So short little interlude. One thing, like I'm a little bit too young for this, but like my favorite papers are like all written in the 90s. Because it was like super fun then. Like it was like all the stories that you hear of like crypto, like people were like proposing schemes and then they get like broken in the rump session, and it's like, and there's all these like beautiful attacks that are like elementary number theory, and you're just like, oh, this is so great. And like it is not that fun anymore. Like the papers are like so long and they're like so complicated, and like the attack techniques are like so long and it's so complicated. Like it's like way less fun. Like talking to some of the people that I interviewed, you know, for example, like Paul Kocher, okay, he like invented side channel attacks like against cryptography. And basically he said that like, you know, he started by doing classical cryptanalysis, but then that got too hard. And so like when the actual like classical cryptanalysis, like when people improved their implementations so much that you couldn't just like break them outright, you needed stronger attack techniques. So you needed a better attack technique, invent side channel attacks. It turns out that like nobody can protect against side channel attacks. That's kind of like one direction. Emmanuel Thomé had like sort of points out that there's been this shifting balance. So like there used to be a lot more cryptanalysis papers 25 or 30 years ago, and we see like far fewer now. And some of that, so Antoine Ju says like with provable security, people are making fewer and fewer stupid mistakes, the kinds of things that made cryptanalysis possible without breaking the algorithms. Sometimes there are things left over, but it's really getting harder to get interesting results. So in some sense, this is good news for the constructive side, that there are better tools, there are better proof techniques, there's better analysis. So you can publish papers without making like super embarrassing mistakes. But this also means there's fewer targets for up and coming researchers to like, sharpen their teeth on, essentially. And if you want to have like a pipeline of people who know how to do cryptanalysis, they have to publish papers on something. So the question is what? Like, are we training the next generation of like cryptanalysis researchers? And clearly we still are, because there are still like, young people who are working on these kinds of things. So like Thomas Biteau, he got his PhD a few years ago, so I guess is like fairly young. And like his philosophy towards breaking lattice schemes is there's like 3 things that you can do. You can look at the scheme and you can get like an incremental algorithmic improvement on some fundamental hard problem like LWE or whatever. You can look at the crazy new assumptions that people have to come up with, because if you actually want to build like fully homomorphic encryption or like zero knowledge proofs or whatever, like you need some special variant of like ring LWE. You can't just use like the main scheme. And so like those variants are more subject to attack. But like if you can't break that, then you just do a side channel. And you know that the side channel is going to work. So like that's how you publish the paper. And that's why there's so many side channel papers, right? But this means that like people in the popular press think that side channels are an actual real problem. Even though like it's a super strong like threat model that's like your adversary is running a process like co-located on the same processor as yours. So like this is one of these weird incentive things that like people have to publish papers somehow. People are not publishing nearly as many papers on like social engineering techniques, even though we know like that's actually how companies get hacked and not side channel attacks. But then the companies are like, oh, we really have to fix this, like whatever this new like meltdown variant that is coming out. So that's like a weird thing that's coming out. Like the imbalances in our field that we have to keep publishing papers means that companies are focusing on the wrong things in a weird way. So from a paper publishing perspective, like if you're a student, here's one way to think about like how to look at solve a problem is like you have some target problem you want to solve, you have a collection of attack techniques, and you iterate through your collection of attack techniques, and you try to just whack your problem with each of them and see if you get a hit. So that's one way to do something, yeah?
Is it actually true that the companies are focusing on the things that people publish, or they know better?
I think a lot of companies are freaking out about like patching against like the most latest like side channel attack.
But it's also easier to patch against that than to prevent social engineering attacks.
Yes. So, I mean, there may be an effect of like you do what you can, and certainly you will look irresponsible if like if you like don't patch against a thing that somebody told you were vulnerable against, but like maybe that's not the best use of time. Was there a hint? You have a hint?
Well, since we're saying like we're making all these papers for like one things about like side channel attacks, like and the companies are like looking at them and getting worried. Can't you just at the end say don't worry about it? That's not too long. Or is that like not in set? Like is that not?
But then nobody will publish it.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't say your paper is like the most important thing to happen, like the reviewers are definitely not going to accept it. Your university is going to be much happier if you got a lot of press about your article. And the press, they have to say that it's like the newest and greatest attack. because like that's why it's novel. So there's whole layers of incentives here where like we know the game that we're playing, but not everybody else knows the game that we're playing.
Surely you feel like some different person would feel like publishing a paper saying these.
I have thought about how to write the paper of like, is anybody actually exploiting a side channel attack ever?
It's a good title.
Is anybody exploiting a side channel attack? So I have asked around if anybody has ever seen exploitation of a side channel attack. And so the, and people are always like, yeah, we saw some like CCC talk from like whenever where somebody did a side channel attack. So I have seen, so there was one super fun paper like a couple years ago. What was the name of the scheme? It was like a broken European proprietary encryption scheme where in order to reverse engineer the scheme, they had to do a blind AES cache attack against the encrypted firmware that they were trying to break. So that is clearly a case where like those kinds of vulnerability researchers, like it turns out that like doing an AES cache attack can actually be the way that you get your keys in order to like decrypt the firmware that you're trying to reverse engineer. So that is a side channel attack threat model that I will absolutely accept, that like you have the hardware, you can do all the side channels you want. Also, like apparently the like people stealing pay TV and stuff were totally like doing side channel attacks to steal the whatever the encryption key of the day was. So like that kind of threat model where like the attacker has like unlimited physical access to like a machine that is like doing encryption, that's definitely like a real side channel model. But then the case of like general software, the most that I've heard is that apparently like the Spectre and Meltdown code was included in like Metasploit or like some like version of that appeared in some malware. But I've never heard of like a real attack of that form.
IP cores are stolen. It's like one of the ways to steal technology is to do an attack of the decryptor, which loads the software onto the FPGA. So that's a practical one. And there are some other government sectors where they probably do this type of thing, but they're not going to publish it.
Yeah, I believe that. So yeah, that's another example of like in order to do reverse engineering or other kinds of stealing, like you actually have like an encrypted target and you have like physical access to it, and a side channel attack is actually the right thing to do. Yeah.
It's not necessarily detectable when these attacks happen necessarily.
That's one of the difficulties in like writing this paper is like how do you prove that something was or was not a side channel attack? So yeah, I don't know how to, like it could be that I'm totally wrong and people are exploiting them all over the place, but usually it's not the easiest way to get data. Okay. For the students, I want to say there is another approach to solving problems that you can adopt, which is, this is an anecdote about Feynman from this fun talk/essay from Rhoda, 10 Lessons I Wish I'd Been Taught. So he tells this anecdote about Feynman. He was fond of giving the following advice on how to be a genius. You keep a dozen of your favorite problems constantly in your mind, and every time you hear or read a new trick or new result, test against your 12 problems and see whether it helps. Every once in a while, there'll be a hit. People say, how did he do it? He must be a genius. So this is like the opposite direction where you like have some dictionary of target problems, and then every time you learn a new technique, you like whack all of your target problems with it, and every once in a while you get a technique. I think I accidentally ended up doing this, except it turned out to like I would read some like paper from the 90s and then like scan the internet and find somebody who screwed it up and publish a paper. That's how I got a job. Okay. Anyway, that's how I got interested in this stuff. So I want to tell you about classical and factoring and discrete log a little bit. So yes, people still use RSA and Diffie-Hellman like mod primes, and they will be for a long time. And basically, okay, so if we look at the data going across UCSD's network. Right now, about 22% of SSH connections use RSA host keys. 83% of TLS 1.2 connections use RSA signatures. We can't see the signatures in TLS 1.3 because they're encrypted. Good job, TLS 1.3. But certificates are, like, basically this is the fraction of certificates that are using RSA public keys. So their signatures are going to be RSA, like no matter whether you're using TLS 1.2 or 1.3. And TLS 1.3 also, everybody is only using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, but the protocol itself supports a list of named finite field Diffie-Hellman groups that are like specified, hard-coded, smallest size is 2048 bits. So like these are there. And most implementers are skeptical enough about the post-quantum schemes that they are going to be doing hybrid. So we actually are going to still be seeing these schemes for a long time. OK, so going back to our cartoon here, all modern digital infrastructure, if you look at who's actually studying this problem, it's 5 underpaid French researchers. That's it. OK, so we have heard that factoring and discrete log are well understood and well studied problems. The best algorithm that we have for these is called the number field sieve. There is a spooky connection between factoring and finite field discrete log that they're like analogous algorithms for like both in many cases. So number field sieve, this is like a picture of the structure of this algorithm. It's a super complicated algorithm with a billion different parameters that you have to optimize just right in order to get it to work at all. If you optimize everything correctly, asymptotically, your running time is this like ugly looking function, like L of 1/3. There's a parameter n, which is either the modulus or like your prime that you're doing discrete log mod. And then you have this constant, which is in the exponent, which is like cube root of 64/9. And so this L function comes up whenever you need to do heuristics involving the prime number theorem to like get bounds on the smoothness of like random numbers of a particular size. So basically, it's like exponential in like log n to the 1/3. There's this ugly constant in the front, which is in the exponent, so it really matters. And then there's this log n to the 2/3. So like basically, the running times of all of these algorithms have this structure. All right, and then if you look at like concrete progress, this is essentially what factoring and discrete log algorithm progress looks like over the past few decades. You can see there was like constant progress, and then people kind of, I don't know, it sort of petered out. But like factoring is like a little bit, it's like a constant factor harder than discrete log, turns out. For like it's hidden by the asymptotics, but it's slightly harder apparently. And the way that these records work, I think Arjen Lenstra was involved in like most of the ones down here. And then, but like the way it works is like every few years, some academics are like, hey, should we do another factoring record? And everybody like pulls out their like supercomputer access or their own clusters, and then they like, you know, run the software for a little while, like transfer some files over, and then like publish a paper that's basically like a trip report of like, here's what we did. And like doing this kind of computation, honestly, is kind of a drag. Like, so, OK, I had like a small part in like that little most recent bubble, which basically consisted of like babysitting a computation, like part of the computation on my cluster. And like, you have to deal with like file system stuff, and like you get like corruptions, and then like, you know, we have like some ungodly like SSH tunnel open to France, and it's like, you know, the stuff just like goes down, and like maintaining hardware is like a giant drag. So it's, yeah, it's just kind of painful to do. And so it's really like a collection of like funky little academics, most of them in France, who actually do this stuff. So if you actually want to compute like factorizations of integers, the software that you're going to use is called Cato-NFS. It is written by this team in INRIA. They credit many people, but like there's varying amounts of contribution or whatnot. But like this is the software that you want to use. And there have actually been improvements in this area By recent, I mean, I guess, this past couple of decades. So the running time, as we heard of the general number field sieve, is this ugly function here, which has been the same since like 1993 or 1991, whenever. But there actually have been improvements. So for discrete log, the final phase of discrete log, there was an asymptotic improvement that improved the constant in this exponent from cube root of 64/9 to basically like this 1.2. And this makes a huge difference. This is the difference between for like 512 to 1024-bit numbers. Like this is like years of computation. This is like years of computation to like minutes of computation. More spectacularly, in 2013, there was a series of improvements that brought the running time for discrete log in a finite field of small characteristic from this sub-exponential running time, like L of 1/3, to quasi-polynomial. So like basically n to the like O of log n. And this freaked a bunch of people out, but there was no sort of obvious extension to large characteristic finite field, which is what we actually use for cryptography or to factoring. So like that sort of petered out. But I want to say, like, even if you had a tiny looking improvement in the running time, so like if you could improve this cube root of 64/9 to cube root of 32/9, so this is the running time of the special number, what's called the special number field sieve. This is academically easy for 1024-bit factoring. This was done 15 years ago by academics. If you improved this 1/3 to a 1/4, this would take out 2048 bits. So if you think that 2048-bit RSA is not going to be done anytime soon, you are putting a bet that this 1/3 can never be improved to a 1/4, which this is an ugly looking running time. Like, do you really think that's the running time for such a fundamental sounding problem as factoring? Like, how willing are you to bet on this?
What about elliptic curve and
Yeah, some bizarre.
Well, why is it? I mean, who's working on it? 500 paid French people. Okay. So just back of the envelope, it's like, why has nobody done 1024-bit RSA? The answer is because, like, I mean, somebody could have, like, clearly this was done by the NSA like 15 years ago. Like, if they didn't do it, like, what are our tax dollars for? This is like without any algorithmic improvements, and this is running on CPUs. So, like, you know, call up Srini and like build some like special purpose hardware, and like, you know, you bring this down by a factor of 100, and like you're golden, basically. So, like, yeah, it's clearly feasible. It's just that like this is a pain for academics. So like we're talking about doing it. You know, we'll probably do it soon. I don't know. But like, okay, why hasn't there been any improvement? And the thing is, nobody's working on this problem. So as I said, it's 5 underpaid French people. They're like in Nancy, and then if you want to count Antoine Joux, he's in like Saarbrücken now. But like, basically, one of the things that happened with like provable cryptography is that we had this separation between constructions and cryptanalysis, and people focused a lot more on the constructions, and they were insulated from the actual mathematical structure of the problems that they were working on, which meant that like they just said, assumption, factoring is hard, we're done. And we don't need to learn all of this like complicated math that's involved in the number field sieve. And so you don't have a pipeline of students who understand these things. Nobody studies this in the US. And so the work has like sort of gone elsewhere. So like literally nobody is sort of thinking about this. Within France, it's kind of an interesting structure that the structure of INRIA as like a scientific lab, they actually, like the researchers are actually supported, like doing software development is part of their job, and so they can be like, oh, I only published like 1 paper this year, but I like built this software package, and so like they get evaluated on that. This is not something that you can do in the US as a professor. Like you have to like pump out papers. You can't be like, oh, I published this software package. But sort of more fundamentally, like one of the reasons I think nobody's working on this is like within computer science, this is not a good topic for grad students to work on because you're not going to get a job. The jobs are, if you study cryptography, you're going to go work for a company who wants to build FHE or like wants somebody to help them with their post-quantum transition. Studying something like the number field sieve is not going to get you a job. And so like I can't in good faith, like recommend grad students work on this topic, which means that nobody except these 5 underpaid French people is working on it. Everybody's like, oh, factoring is a super well-studied problem. But really, the people who were studying it in the early 90s, they're all retiring, and there isn't another generation. So I think, yeah, that's like one of the structural issues. So if you compare the like billions of dollars a year being put into quantum computing to the current investment in the kinds of research that would lead to factoring and discrete log improvements classically, it's at most hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to like fund like a team of a handful of French researchers and like a few grad students. So that's where the incentives are not aligned. And so like if you talk to the people who actually understand this topic, like Emmanuel Thomé is willing to put out there that he thinks the correct running time for factoring and discrete log is quasi-polynomial, but we don't know how to do it. Like obviously if they knew how to do it, like you would do it. So like you could like get some increased investment, but it's unclear what the payoff would be because maybe the technology to do it doesn't exist. I don't know. Like we can't actually say that we're going to have it. So Emmanuel says that like if there was more investment like in the field, maybe you could have found the small characteristics discrete log improvements like 5 to 10 years earlier. So possibly something like that is true for factoring, but maybe it's just actually that is the running time. We don't actually know. Yeah.
Even before the number of IMSIV and the quadratic sieve and so forth came up, there was Schwarzman's algorithm, which only worked for small characteristics and got the right kind of runtime. So to the extent that history is repeats, unprobable more rather.
Yeah, so I mean, there could be a real difference between small characteristic and large characteristic discrete log, because yeah, there were like structural things that you can do in small characteristic that you just cannot do in large characteristic. So yeah, might be.
What about the discrete log problem in elliptic curve?
I have a little bit about that later. Yeah. Yeah, a couple. Yeah. Okay. I can speed up. Maybe I will. I'll speed through the isogeny part, but like we had this amazing spectacular break on psych, and like, but the isogeny people are like, don't worry, the field is healthy. We're super happy. And the thing is, like, right now it's the same people doing constructive cryptography and cryptanalysis in isogenies, there's like a feedback loop between the constructions and the cryptanalysis that is actually much healthier than in other areas, which this was just posted the other day, and it's amazing. Like this preprint was posted and then it was broken the next day. So this is like going back to the 90s. So if you want an exciting area, isogenies, the isogeny club people are like deliriously happy. And so they're like, don't worry, higher dimensional isogenies are great. So we're going to build everything. The spicy thing that I want to say that was brought up by Kastrick and Ducru, who I talked about, is that if you look at elliptic curve discrete log versus factoring, the people are worried about elliptic curve discrete log from a quantum perspective because our key sizes are so much smaller for elliptic curves than for factoring. But there's another thing which is going on, which is sort of this dictionary between number theory and algebraic geometry, which exists like sort of all the way through mathematics, which is that there's a lot of problems on the number theory side that are hard. So problems over the integers are hard for some reason. So like factoring integers is hard, like SVP over an integer lattice is hard. The Riemann hypothesis is pretty hard to resolve. If you look at the analogous problems in like the function field world, everything is easier over polynomials and their extensions. So like factoring polynomials is easy. Solving SVP is easy over a lattice of polynomials and any lattice with like a non-Archimedean norm. Like the analog of the Riemann hypothesis was resolved quite some time ago for function fields. And so elliptic curve discrete log lives on this side of this table. And so like from the mathematical perspective, and this is way beyond my math knowledge, the elliptic curve discrete log problem has a lot more structure than factoring. It's an isogeny finding problem, and as we've seen, there are improvements that have been made in isogenies. The existing isogeny attacks fail because the degree of the isogeny is secret, but in general, what was pointed out is sort of the geometry of elliptic curves is easier over finite fields. Some people will argue like maybe like elliptic curve groups are the closest to like abstract groups that we could get, but this is food for thought if you like sort of academic conspiracy theories. So I think I am over time, so I will maybe skip to the end. Yeah.
There's this perhaps academic question of, can you find any way in which elliptic curves behave differently from a generic elliptical groups behave differently from a generic? That could be like a contrived problem that you can show is hard in the generic model, but you haven't done. We don't have such an example, right? To the best of my knowledge.
Is there any?
But that's for supersingular curves.
Okay, so is there any way in which elliptic curve groups behave differently from generic groups?
Defined. Supersingular
Yeah.
doesn't count, I guess.
If you rule out all the attacks on the special cases.
No. That's one attack. That's one attack.
But there's other. Okay, so yeah, you could take the entire space of elliptic curves and carve it up into classes of curves for which you have attacks or behaviors, and the curves that we are using for cryptography have basically been chosen so that like none of those characteristics apply. And so then, okay, we don't know, but like, yeah, I guess, yeah, to your point, we do have cases of elliptic curves that behave differently.
But those curves have sort of a hard, potentially difficult problem, right? And I'm saying make up your own g to the powers of some x and then something. Can you come up with a contrived problem which is harder in the generic group world than for these curves that are used in practice? Perhaps an academic question, but would sort of give some insight into why these guys behave differently from a generic group, right?
That would be, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if anybody has done that. There was a little bit of an argument, I guess I sped by it, the riddle wrapped in an enigma article by Koblitz and Menezes, sort of talking about like, is it possible that the NSA has backdoored the elliptic curve standards? They have sort of an argument, maybe it's a little bit different in flavor than what you're suggesting, that like if you wanted to essentially backdoor a family of elliptic curves, like how would you generate it such that like there is like a dense enough set that you would be able to find one? And sort of they argue that it seems unlikely that that would have been possible. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I think I'm over time, so I will wrap up here, and then I guess, yeah, there's stuff that I sped through that didn't talk about, but essentially, like, I think that there's an imbalance in incentives between constructive cryptography and cryptanalysis that leads to late surprises. I sped through the lattice stuff, but if you're a student, lattice assumptions, great project, and a focus on constructions is probably best if you want to actually be employed. And there is a serious lack of number theorists in cryptography in the United States for various structural reasons. And I think that we do not have the end of the story for classical factoring discrete log and elliptic curve discrete log, but there is a real incentive gap for research. We need to have a healthier population of like real number theorists, and I'm not a real number theorist working on this stuff. And this is also not a good project for grad students. Although perhaps if you work with Vinod, he can come up with like a compelling story that may help like make progress. I don't know. But anyway, so that is my shortened version of spicy opinions. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Maybe another spicy question, but I'm wondering, like, I think there are a lot of things in the world that are very productive that we have decided are not meant to be academy. And do you think, like, is this something that's like just a public good and the government should just fund separately? Like, there should be like, this should have like an analysis section, and this is not really a good fit for research, or is this actually a good fit for research? We need to like restructure these centers.
I mean, I think it is a good idea to call cryptanalysis like a public good that should be sort of funded like separately from like the market, or like we shouldn't rely on commercial incentives to fund this kind of thing. I guess the U.S. government's approach for a very long time was that like this is the job of the NSA, and so like they do fund large numbers of like very, very good mathematicians to think about these problems all day and all night, but then they wouldn't tell the rest of us about it. I mean, like the relationship between NIST and the NSA was supposed to be that like NIST would be like, hey, and the NSA would be like, don't do this or this or this, and then like they would go back. But now we no longer trust the NSA to like be truthful in doing that. So there is an argument to be said that like, yeah, maybe we should have like a public, like a more public facing research group who does that kind of thing. And like we do have national labs, but you know, cryptography tends to be like a very high clearance level, and so stuff doesn't like come out of that direction. So this is one way where I think Europe really does do a better job, because if like you look at France, you look at all the people at INRIA, like a lot of the people that I mentioned are like at INRIA or like were in Europe, because like, you know, Germany has Max Planck Institutes and like France has INRIA, and like we have these other, you know, basically like government funded organizations where they're like, we're going to do fundamental research in computational number theory and it will be good for the world. So yeah, it might be nice to have that. Structurally, I mean, I think one issue in the US is it's great that most of our universities are funded by the governments in a lot of ways, but it's led to weird incentives. Like I'm at the University of California, which like originally was generously funded by the state of California, but they've like been cutting funding over the decades, and then it's been made up for by NSF funding, but like if we have political instability that is like causing our grants to come into question, then like it's hard to, yeah. But then people are making up for that by like, let's get corporate funding. But now the corporations are like, we only want to fund AI. So yeah, I mean, it's a mess a little bit. Yeah?
Abstract question. So you talk about how there's some like a lot of attack things that there's not enough money. I mean, it costs a lot of money, you need a lot of expertise, you need a lot of effort. That's like just kind of not worth a lot of grad students to do it. Doesn't this also mean that like since they're so hard and not worth doing, like nobody will actually try to do it, and so like it's pretty it's gonna be secure for a while.
Well, so okay, if the attack is too much of a pain for academics to carry out, does that mean that the scheme is secure?
Yeah, like, we don't get worried about it for now.
So I would argue that the incentives of different organizations are different, and so we know that there are governments who have a very strong incentive to break cryptography, and so I guess the question is like, if you are Google and you consider both the NSA and the Chinese government to be a potential adversary in this area, and these governments are willing to put in hundreds of millions of dollars towards cryptanalysis in the private, in their government organizations, but they are a threat, but you are Google, so you're relying on what the public research community is telling you to use. Then there's a misalignment there.
So you're saying it's possible that the governments will, like, solve whatever the problems that you're saying that like academics are not.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, as I said, if the NSA wasn't factoring 1024-bit RSA 15 years ago or more, where are my tax dollars going? Like, I will be personally disappointed if they do not have like their machine just set up like crunching, well, both 1024-bit discrete log and factoring. And like, they have people who can build special purpose hardware. They have the best people in the world who can design algorithmic improvements, even like get constant factor improvements that like, come on, it has to be feasible. Like if they're not doing, I'm very disappointed in them. But like, yeah, they have, and we know that they want to do it and that they have an actual incentive to do it and they have the budget to do it. Whereas like 5 underpaid French researchers are very interested in the topic but do not have the resources of the NSA.
We should probably leave it there.
Yeah,
Thanks.
cool.